At the end of part 1, I left you with a night and a hillside. About 3 years after a boy walked out of a grove of trees, believing he'd spoken with God. He said a second visitor came to him and told him a record lay buried in the ground not far from his father's farm. So tonight, we go and dig it up, and we ask the one question that actually matters. Can the men who said they held it in their hands be trusted? Let me set the ground fast, because part 1 did the slow work on that single morning, and I'm not going to make you sit through it twice. This is part 2 of 5. So here's the one thing I need you carrying in with you. Part 1 made a claim, a big one, and then years went by, and the boy went back to the plow, and to almost everyone around him, nothing about him had changed at all. If you haven't seen that first part, go start there, because it's the ground everything tonight stands on. But right here is where the story changes shape. My promise on this channel hasn't moved since part 1. I'll take the question seriously. I'll treat every side of it as fairly as I know how, and I'll stay faithful without ever getting loud about it. And honestly, that promise matters even more here than it did last time. Because this is the stretch of the Joseph Smith story where things stop being quiet and start getting physical. Think about it for a second. Part 1 was one boy, alone in the trees, with nobody to back up a single word he said. You couldn't check it. What we're about to walk through is a different animal. Now there's an object at the center of it, an ancient record he called the plates. And there are other people, named people, real men, who signed a printed statement swearing they saw it with their own eyes. That changes the whole shape of the argument. You can call a lonely vision a dream and walk away. It's a lot harder to wave off 11 other men who put their names in a book, and who then, some of them, spent the rest of their lives being asked to take it back, quick and honest, before we climb that hill together. This channel is young, and it's here for one reason: to tell the story of this faith the way it actually happened, the hard parts left in, and to help carry the word of the restoration to people who only ever got handed the tidy version. If that's something you want more of, a like and a subscribe genuinely help a small channel that's still finding its feet. And I like knowing who's out there with me. So leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. So here's where we're walking together. First, we go to the hill, and we meet the messenger Joseph said sent him there. And we sit with the strange 4-year wait before he was ever allowed to bring the record home. Then we pull up a chair at the translation table, and I'll show you exactly how he said the translating got done, including the part most people were never taught in a Sunday class. The part with the stone and the hat, stated plainly, with its real source named, because I would so much rather you hear it from me than stumble onto it later and feel like somebody hid it from you. Then we meet the witnesses, the 3 and the 8. And I'll build the case that every one of them was either fooled or lying. And I'll build it as hard as I honestly can. And only then do we test whether it holds. There's a thread that runs through this whole episode, one quiet fact, and I want you holding it the entire time. Several of these witnesses later broke with Joseph Smith completely. They left his church, some of them bitterly. And not one of them, right to the end of a long life, is credibly on record taking back what he said he saw. Hold on to that. It's the hinge the whole thing turns on. Start with the messenger, because everything downstream depends on him, and because he's the figure the quick videos race right past. Joseph didn't say he stumbled onto some buried treasure. He said a heavenly messenger told him exactly where to look, and then made him wait 4 years before he was allowed to so much as touch it. By Joseph's own account, and by the family records gathered in the Joseph Smith papers, which is the scholarly project that's published his surviving documents, the night in question was the 21st of September, 1823. Joseph was 17 by then, not the 14-year-old from the Grove anymore. He said he was praying at night, in the bedroom he shared with his brothers, when the room filled with light, and a personage appeared, standing in the air beside his bed. This being called him by name, said he was a messenger sent from God, and gave his name as Moroni. Now that name will mean nothing to you if you're outside this faith. So let me tell you who that is, because it matters. In the account Joseph would later publish as the Book of Mormon, Moroni was a real man, an ancient prophet and record keeper who'd lived on the American continent more than 1,000 years earlier. The last of his people, the one who buried the record before he died. So sit with how specific Joseph's claim actually is. The very man who'd hidden the record in the ground was now standing in his bedroom as a resurrected being to tell him where to find it. And the messenger described what was down there. He said there was a book written on plates that had the look of gold, engraved by ancient hands, and that it held the history and the religious record of the former inhabitants of this continent. He said buried alongside it were 2 stones set in silver bows, an instrument prepared by God for translating the record. Joseph and the people around him would come to call that instrument the Urim and Thummim, borrowing a phrase from the Old Testament for a device the ancient Israelite priests used to seek the will of God. Hold on to that phrase, Urim and Thummim, because it's going to come back when we reach the translation. For tonight, just take this much. Joseph said he was told there was a record, that it was ancient, that it was written in a language he couldn't read, and that God had buried the means of reading it right there beside it. Then comes the detail I find genuinely strange, the kind of thing a fabricator would have had little reason to invent, because it does nothing to make the story more impressive, and quite a lot to make it more frustrating. Joseph didn't get to keep the plates that night, or that year, or the year after that. He said that the very next morning, worn out, he went to the hill the messenger had shown him in vision, a rise of ground a few miles from his home that the record would later make famous under the name Cumorah, and that he found the plates exactly where he'd been told, buried in a stone box near the top. And when he reached for them, he said he was stopped, told he wasn't ready, told he had to come back to that same spot on that same date once a year and be instructed before he'd be trusted with the record at all. So picture the shape of the next 4 years. Once a year, every autumn, a poor and unschooled young man walks out to a hillside to meet a resurrected prophet and gets told, "Not yet." 1823, 1824, 1825, 1826. 4 annual appointments, 4 years of instruction, and, by the family's account, of being told he was still not spiritually ready, still too focused on the worldly worth of a book that looked like gold, instead of on the record it carried. Whatever you make of the plates themselves, notice what that 4-year delay does to the story. It's the opposite of what a con man writes. A con man produces the golden book as fast as he possibly can, while the excitement is hot. Joseph's account has him waiting and waiting and getting turned away for 4 straight years. He finally got the record on the 22nd of September, 1827, on the 4th of those annual returns. 21 now, and newly married to a young woman named Emma Hale, who we'll meet properly later in this series. And the moment he brought it home, the trouble started, which is its own kind of evidence about the world he was living in. Word tore through the county that the Smith boy had dug up a golden book, and in a poor farming region where rumors of buried treasure were common currency, that word drew exactly the crowd you'd expect. Joseph said neighbors tried again and again to steal the record, that he had to hide it in a hollow log, under the hearth, in a barrel of beans, that his family got harassed and his home got searched. The plates had come home at last, and what came with them wasn't glory. It was a siege. And that's the first thing I want you to sit with. The coming forth of this record, in Joseph's own telling, wasn't a triumph. It was 4 years of being told to wait, and then a young man hiding a heavy bundle in a barrel while his neighbors tried to break into the house. Now come sit down with me at the translation table, because this is where I have to be the most careful and the most honest. There's a detail about how this record got translated that a lot of faithful people were simply never taught. And when they find it later, they feel deceived. I'm not going to let that happen to you. I'm going to put it right in front of you plainly, right now, with its source named. Here's the picture most members of the church grew up with. And it's not so much wrong as it is incomplete. Joseph has the plates. He has the Urim and Thummim, those 2 stones in the silver bows that came with the record. And he uses that instrument to read the ancient characters off in English, while a scribe writes the words down. That's the version in most of the paintings. A young man at a table, the plates open in front of him, studying them as he translates. And part of the time, that's roughly what the sources describe, but it's not the whole of what the sources describe. And the church itself has said so, out in the open, in plain language. Some years back, the Church of Jesus Christ published a series of candid essays on its own hardest historical questions. They're called the Gospel Topics Essays. One of them is titled Book of Mormon Translation, and I'm pointing you to it by name so you can go read it yourself tonight and not take my word for a single sentence of this. That essay lays out without flinching the fuller picture the early witnesses actually left us. And the fuller picture includes a second instrument and an unexpected method. Alongside the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates, Joseph also used what the people around him called a seer stone. Let me define that, because everything hard about this chapter lives inside that phrase. A seer stone was a small stone, in Joseph's case a brown or chocolate-colored one about the size of an egg, that Joseph, like a good number of his neighbors in the folk culture of that time and place, believed could be used to see things the natural eye couldn't, things lost or hidden or far away. Before there was any translating to do at all, Joseph was already known in his neighborhood for owning and using a stone like that. And according to the people who watched the translation happen, including scribes who sat right across the table from him, for a good stretch of the work, Joseph didn't stare at the plates at all. He put the seer stone into a hat, put his face down into the hat to block out the light, and read off the English words he said appeared to him there, while the scribe wrote them down. The plates themselves often lay wrapped in a cloth on the table, or weren't even in the room. I want to let that sit because I know how it lands the first time. A stone in a hat. The record he was supposedly translating sometimes not even open in front of him. And I know some of you just heard that for the very first time and felt something drop. If your gut reaction is that this sounds less like scholarship and more like folk magic, I'm not going to tell you that reaction is stupid, because it isn't. It's the honest reaction, and we're going to deal with it head on in a few minutes when we build the case for fraud, because this is exactly the kind of detail that case gets built on. For right now, I'm only asking you to notice one thing. You didn't have to pry this loose from anybody. The church printed it. It's on the church's own website, under the church's own name, with the sources footnoted. Whatever else is true here, the stone and the hat are not some secret that critics exposed. They're a fact the institution published about itself. And the work itself moved in fits and starts before it ever found a rhythm. The first serious stretch of translation, in 1828, was done with a well-to-do local farmer named Martin Harris as scribe, a man who'd mortgaged his own farm to help pay for the eventual printing. And that first stretch produced the most painful setback of the whole project. Harris, under pressure from a skeptical wife and his own understandable hunger for proof, kept begging Joseph to let him take the finished manuscript home to show his family. Joseph, by the account, asked God twice and was refused twice, asked a third time, and was finally allowed to lend it out under strict conditions. And the manuscript, 116 handwritten pages, months of work, vanished while it was in Harris's keeping and was never recovered. To this day, nobody knows what became of those pages. And notice, again, this is not how an invented story behaves. A man making the whole thing up loses nothing by losing a stack of paper. He just rewrites it. Joseph's account has him devastated, stripped of the record and the instrument for a time as a rebuke, and specifically warned not to simply retranslate the lost portion, because dishonest men were waiting to catch him in any difference between the new version and the pages they still held. What he produced instead covered the same span of history from a different set of plates. Whatever you believe about where it came from, that response to the crisis is a strange and disciplined thing for a fraud to pull. The translation that produced the book we actually have came in an astonishing burst the following year. In April of 1829, a young schoolteacher named Oliver Cowdery showed up, having heard about the work, and offered himself as scribe. And with Cowdery holding the pen, the two of them finished the vast bulk of the Book of Mormon, hundreds of printed pages, in roughly 3 months, between April and June of 1829. That pace is worth stopping on, whatever you conclude about the source, because it's genuinely hard to explain in ordinary terms. a barely schooled young farmer dictating a long and internally consistent book, complicated in its structure, hundreds of pages of it, mostly by ear, in about 90 working days, with no notes visible in front of him, and, by every account of the scribes, without ever once asking to have the previous day's work read back to him. The book went to a printer in Palmyra, a man named Egbert Grandin, and it was published in the spring of 1830. And that's the second thing I want you holding. However the translation happened, the how of it is stranger and more specific than the tidy painting. And the honest version, stone, hat, lost pages and all, is not the version critics dragged into the light. It's the version the church put there itself. So now we come to the heart of it, the part I built this whole episode around. Joseph wasn't the only person who claimed to have seen the record. 11 other men signed their names to it, in print, in the front of the book. And I'm about to make the strongest case I possibly can that every last one of them was either deceived or dishonest. I'll build that case as hard as I know how before I answer one word of it. First, understand why the witnesses exist at all, because it's a genuinely shrewd move, and I want to give it its due. Joseph had an obvious problem. He was asking the world to believe in an ancient golden record that he'd then handed back to the angel, so that no scholar, no skeptic, no reporter could ever examine it. That is, on its face, exactly the setup of a hoax, a book that only the prophet ever really got to see. And so, according to the account, God provided that a small number of other people would be allowed to see the plates too, and would be commanded to testify of it to the world, so that Joseph wouldn't stand alone. Their signed statements were printed in the very first edition of the Book of Mormon in 1830, and they're printed in every copy to this day. There are two of them, the testimony of the 3 witnesses and the testimony of the 8. The 3 witnesses were Oliver Cowdery, the scribe, David Whitmer, a young man on whose family farm the translation had been finished, and Martin Harris, the farmer who'd lost the pages and then, remarkably, stayed. Their testimony describes something openly supernatural. They said an angel of God came down and stood before them and showed them the plates and the engravings on them, and that they heard the voice of God declare the record had been translated correctly. It happened, by their account, out in the woods, in prayer, in the summer of 1829. A vision, a heavenly manifestation, not a casual handling. The 8 witnesses gave a very different kind of statement, and the difference really matters. They were mostly members of 2 families, 4 of the Whitmers, plus Joseph's own father and 2 of his brothers, Hiram and Samuel. And their testimony has no angel in it at all. It's flat, physical, matter of fact. They said Joseph Smith showed them the plates, that they handled them with their own hands, hefted the weight of them, saw the ancient engravings, and turned the leaves. Where the 3 describe a vision, the 8 describe an afternoon. A heavy object passed around and looked over in ordinary daylight. Now let me build the case against all of them, and I'm going to build it the way a sharp skeptic really builds it, because you deserve the real version and not a soft one. It goes like this. Look at who these men actually were. They weren't neutral outsiders brought in to inspect the evidence. Every single one of them was already a believer, already financially or personally invested in Joseph's success, before he ever claimed to see a plate. Martin Harris had mortgaged his farm for the project. David Whitmer's family had housed and fed the translation. The 8 witnesses were, with almost no exceptions, either Joseph's blood relatives or the Whitmer family, whose fortunes were now tied to his. This isn't a jury. It's a circle of insiders, with everything to gain from the story being true. Then look at the nature of what the 3 say they saw. Not a plain object in daylight, but an angel in the woods, at the peak of a shared religious excitement, after they'd prayed themselves into a fervor for exactly that kind of manifestation. A skeptic has a clean word for that: suggestion. A charismatic leader and 3 primed, believing men worked up together in prayer until they see the very thing they've all been aching to see. And the skeptic will tell you the witness's own later words give the game away, because David Whitmer, questioned for decades afterward, would sometimes describe the experience in the language of vision and spiritual sight rather than ordinary eyesight. And a critic reads that as a quiet admission that it only ever happened in their minds. As for the 8, the ones who handled a physical object, the skeptic just says a man with the skill to fake a translation had the skill to fake a heavy set of engraved metal leaves, tin or lead gilded to look like gold, and to let his father and his brothers heft a fake wrapped in a cloth. Family will heft what family is told to heft. And then the skeptic closes with the hardest point of all, the one about Joseph himself. This is a young man who, before any of this, was already known around his county for putting a stone in a hat and hiring himself out to hunt for buried treasure. A man who'd been hauled into court in connection with exactly that kind of folk money digging. And now that same young man, with that same stone and that same hat, produces a buried golden treasure and a book to go with it, and gathers up his financial backers and his own family to swear they saw it. Put it all together, the skeptic says, and you don't have a miracle. You've got a talented, charismatic young man, a folk practice he already knew cold, a set of witnesses picked entirely from among people who loved him and needed him to be right, and a piece of physical evidence that conveniently went back to heaven before anyone impartial could ever weigh it. That's the case for fraud, and stated that way, honestly, it has real teeth. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and anyone who tells you it's stupid hasn't actually listened to it. So does it hold? The skeptics laid out a clean story, primed believers and a clever young man, and I promised I wouldn't flinch from it. But before you sign your name to that verdict, there's one fact this whole case has to get past. And in my judgment, it's the fact the thing breaks on. Here it is, and it's simple. Almost all of these men eventually broke with Joseph Smith. Not gently, either. The 3 principal witnesses especially, Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris, every one of the 3 fell out with Joseph and left the church, and 2 of them were formally excommunicated in bitter circumstances in 1838, right in the middle of the movement's worst internal collapse. These were not star-struck loyalists to the end. For a while there, they became some of Joseph Smith's most alienated critics. Oliver Cowdery, the man who'd held the pen for nearly the entire Book of Mormon, was cast out, and he spent about a decade outside the church practicing law. David Whitmer left and never came back. Not once for the rest of his long life. Martin Harris drifted through a string of other faiths and stayed estranged for decades. Now think carefully about what that hands us, because it's the exact opposite of what the fraud case predicts. The fraud case says these men testified because they loved Joseph and needed him to be right. Fine. But then they stopped loving him. They stopped needing him. They walked away angry, with every earthly reason in the world to expose the whole thing if it had been a trick. A man who helped fake a golden book, and who then gets humiliated and thrown out by the very prophet he helped, has the motive of a lifetime to stand up and say, "It was a lie. I helped him do it, and here's how." That confession would have been the most valuable testimony in America. Newspapers would have paid for it. Every enemy the church ever made would have carried that man around on their shoulders. And not one of the 11 ever gave it. Instead, they did something the fraud case can't easily explain. They kept affirming it. Oliver Cowdery, out of the church and working as a lawyer, reportedly told people he knew what he'd seen and wouldn't deny it. And years later, in 1848, he humbled himself and asked to be rebaptized into the very church that had cast him out, still testifying of the record. Martin Harris, after decades away, did the same, and traveled to Utah as an old man to rejoin the saints, his witness intact. And David Whitmer, the one who never came back, is in some ways the most powerful of all, precisely because he had nothing left to gain by lying. He lived out his days in Richmond, Missouri, a respected citizen outside the church, and he got interviewed again and again by people who wanted nothing more than to hear the old man finally crack. He never did. Late in his life, in 1887, stung by rumors that he'd recanted, he published a pamphlet, an address to all believers, in which he reaffirmed as plainly as words allow that he had seen the angel and the plates, and in the same breath freely criticized Joseph Smith and the church he'd left. Read that carefully, and you see a man doing something almost no liar ever does, attacking the leader, defending the miracle. He had every incentive on earth to drop the story, and he carried it to his grave. And it's not only the 3, the 8 witnesses, the ones who handled the record in plain daylight, split the very same way over the years, and they held the very same line. Several of them also left the church. 2 of the Whitmer brothers among the 8, John and Jacob, were pushed out or drifted away in the same bitter season of the late 1830s. And Hiram Page, another of the 8, left as well. Every one of them had the same open door in front of him that the 3 had. The chance to say the handling had been staged, that his brother-in-law or his neighbor had passed around a painted fake. Not one of them walked through it. John Whitmer, estranged and never returning, went on affirming to anyone who asked that he'd held the plates and turned the leaves with his own hands. And on the other end of the family, Hiram Smith, Joseph's older brother and one of the 8, carried his witness in the most final way a man can. He was shot to death beside Joseph in a jail at Carthage, Illinois, in 1844, and he died having never once taken it back. Whichever direction a given witness went, toward the church or away from it, into old age or into a jail cell, the testimony traveled with him unbroken. Now I have to be fair in the other direction too, because I told you I wouldn't resolve the hard part in the church's voice, and I'm not going to. Refusing to recant is not the same thing as being right. It's entirely possible for a sincere man to go to his grave testifying in complete honesty to something his own mind produced. Sincerity is not proof. What the witness's constancy establishes, and establishes very strongly, is that they were not knowing con men. It rules out the simplest version of the fraud theory, the one where Joseph and a few cronies cook up a hoax and split the proceeds. Because knowing con men who lose everything and get humiliated do not protect the con for 50 more years with nothing left to gain. But it does not, all by itself, prove that a real angel stood in those woods. A skeptic can fall back to a second line and say the men were sincerely deceived, that they experienced something real to them that just wasn't what they thought it was. That's a far more respectable objection than the hoax theory, and I'm not going to insult you by pretending the witness's testimony flattens it. Whether what they saw was what they believed it was is, in the end, a question of faith. Faith is yours to weigh. It's not mine to settle for you from behind a desk. But there's a second villain in this story I do want to name plainly, because it's where a lot of the confusion actually comes from, and it isn't the honest skeptic. It's the sensationalist who quotes the witnesses selectively. You'll find videos and articles that take David Whitmer's careful language about spiritual sight, lift it clean out of the paragraph where he insists in the very next breath that the experience was real and objective to him, and hand you the fragment as if the man confessed to a hallucination. That's not analysis. That's editing. The honest thing, the thing this channel is built on, is to put the whole of what a man said on the table, the vision language and the flat insistence that it happened, and let you weigh the entire testimony instead of the trimmed clip. When you read the full statements instead of the harvested fragments, the picture that comes out isn't of men quietly backing away from a story. It's of men who could not be moved off it, by excommunication, by poverty, by decades of hostile questioning, or by their own falling out with the prophet who started the whole thing. And that's the payoff of this whole episode, the thing I most want you carrying out of it. You are free to conclude that the 11 were sincerely mistaken. What the record will not let you honestly say is that they were a pack of liars who recanted when the pressure came. They did not recant. That's not a matter of faith. That's a matter of the documents. So here's where I land, and you can measure it against where you land, because I'd rather you disagree with me honestly than nod along out of habit. The plates went back, and we can't examine them. But the 11 men did not go back on their word, and we can examine that for the whole rest of their lives. Several of them left the church. Not one of them left his testimony. So let me hand the real question to you. The witnesses never recanted, even after leaving the church. What do you make of that? Tell me in the comments, because I read them, and I want the honest range of how people hold this. And that's exactly where part 3 begins. Because a book, however it came, is only ink until people build something on it. Within months of that printing in 1830, Joseph Smith organized a church around it, and a scattered handful of believers started selling their farms and gathering to one place to build what they called Zion, a literal city of God on the American frontier. What they tried to build, and why it very nearly destroyed them, is the whole story of part 3. I'm Nathan Reeves. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.